Welcome back to today's final session where we will look at the circular economy journey in Canada and the US. This session is held by the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition, and we'd also like to direct a special welcome to Richard Morgan and his colleagues from the Commission for Environmental Cooperation with the renewed under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, with a renewed mandate under the trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the US, as its 2021-2025 strategic plan includes circular economy as one of its six strategic pillars. It is with mixed feelings that we're moving into this session today, as it was originally intended to take place in Toronto. Fortunately, it will still take place in 1 year's time, and this event is intended to serve as a bit of a teaser for next year's event. Different geographies, different contexts. To me, the US and Canada stand out as two education powerhouses that certainly give Finland a run for its money. And I think this also applies to the circular economy with some really great courses in industrial ecology at UCSB, and I think of William McDonough's course in design and innovation at Stanford. There's Université de Montréal, Columbia, and not least Harvard, where the inaugural Harvard Circular Economy Symposium took place in March. It's one of the very last events to happen live before the lockdowns. Things are moving, and after seeing the first two sessions today, I'm confident that they could move faster still.
I second that, Tim. And just to recap and brief the new viewers who are with us now, in the opening session we looked at the need for investments and finance, and in the previous session we took a look at the corporate circularity. Now, recently we've seen a boom of circular economy funds, with American companies accounting for a sizable share of the total holdings. We will now skip over the pond to dig a little deeper into what is happening in the many provinces and states of Canada and the US. And just again, a quick reminder of the technical instructions. You're watching a live event, and the platform that you are already watching this on will give you access to all the relevant information. We really encourage you to ask questions and make comments and take part in the discussion through the chat. This is an open and interactive event. Now, just to get you going, we'd like to put through a poll, and you'll find the vote section in the chat box. Choose your option and click it. And the question simply is, what sector do you represent? And we're seeing answers coming through.
It's a bit of a race. Let's keep the answers coming.
Let's keep the answers coming, but at least it seems that academia is and public sector. Oh, yeah, it's a moving race.
But it is a mixed one, I would say. There's both the business side, academia, and the public sector are all represented here, and media and the third sector as well. So good to see that there's and the public sector is really taking the lead here.
It is certainly, absolutely.
Yeah, well, keep giving the public sector a run for the top spot. For the next hour or so, we will look at the journey towards the circular economy in Canada and the US, looking at opportunities for collaboration between businesses and policymakers. And we'll hear from Canada's Minister for Environment and Climate Change, Jonathan Wilkinson, and then we'll pass things over to Kate Daly and the panelists from Canada and the US. Please also start submitting your questions to the panelists and speakers already. But first up, though, it's time for our first keynote speaker, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, Inger Anderson, who you may also remember from the opening session, where she gave some examples from yeah, ranging from Nigeria to Colombia. But this time around, she's here to talk about North America's specific challenges, looking at the extraction heavy industry there, and that's the challenges there, the context of big tech, and also the potential of city level action. Welcome back, Inger Andersen. It's really good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with you once more. I was there when we opened this morning, and now we opened in the North American space. So it's wonderful to be here. And of course, a real pleasure to speak at the same platform as Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change of Canada. Let me just say that I think we all understand the threats that are facing our planet and the role that circularity can play in solving them. That's why we are here at this conference. But if we know an additional thing, it is surely that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased that urgent need and for action on these three planetary crises that we are currently journeying: the climate crisis, the nature and biodiversity crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. And each of these crises are made by us, by our unsustainable production and consumption, which is the 12th SDG in the global goals. And so as we are now putting through stimulus packages, then clearly there is a real opportunity to put that money to not fund the dirty and the gray, but to flick that green switch towards a green recovery. And that was very much the conversation that we had this morning in the European space. And here I'd like to get to the role that Canada and the US could have in this green recovery. It's self-evident that these two powerhouses, given their influence, given the natural resources wealth, but yes, also given the environmental footprint that that wealth and the resources place, have a special role to play. The combined economies of these two countries make up a quarter of the global economy. And according to the IMF, Canada has the third highest total estimated value of natural resources at $33 billion. The US, the seventh highest. Both countries are not only powerhouses on the resource side, but also powerhouses on innovation, on technology, and on finance. And that is a great cocktail of solutions. The North American transition, however, to circularity, we have to admit, when we look at the global scale of 193 countries, is only in its adolescence. Canada leads the developed world in per capita production of waste, generating 1,587 pounds of waste for every person per year. The US discards about 500 billion pounds of solid waste every year. And 3/4 of this waste could be recycled or repurposed. Yet the current figure is much lower at 30%. And remanufacturing only accounts for 2% of the production in the US. A problem, yes, but a major opportunity. And there are many, many ways to seize that opportunity. And I will just focus on three such opportunities. And I think the first one I want to focus on is one where we've seen some early successes, and that is city level action as a huge driver for change. Cities can adopt circular policies, circular practices, delivering progress and putting a pressure upwards in the rest of the economy. In fact, much of the North American progress we are seeing at the city level, with mayors and city administrations leaning in on this opportunity. And let me mention just one, not to say that there are not many others, because there are, but the city of Phoenix, for example, committed to recycling 40% of its waste by 2020. And it's an amazing story, because by mid-2019, Phoenix had reached 36%, only being in 2015 at 20%, excuse me. So a massive move forward. And Phoenix plans to reach zero waste by 2050, including through a public-private incubator focusing on new uses for waste from textiles, from waste from food scraps, as well as for batteries. And there are many other tactics to retrofit, redesign for circularity in buildings, in building materials, in mobility, in food systems, and much, much more. And of course, we need to use the entire spectrum here. So that's my first point, city level action. The second point that I wanted to raise is that tech giants can really lead the way. They can reform, they can innovate, and they can make that path so that others will follow. And here I'd like to highlight the potential of the American tech giants to make that positive difference. It's an obvious thing. The US tech industry is superbly strong, but materials discarded in this sector of electronics are worth about 57 billion annually in the US, and much more than 80% of these materials do not get collected and into a circular setting. So making devices repairable, recyclable, breaking them down and re-putting them back together, retrofitting and repurposing can dramatically reduce the use of what we as environmentalists are concerned about, the finite use of many of these resources that we just cannot continue to take out of the environment into the economy to make growth, jobs, and opportunity. And once we're done, discard them back into the environment. We obviously need to keep them in the economy. And here, big data, AI, blockchain can help us potentially make better use of these resources by tracing information on the content of products and to understand how and where they can be recycled. Tech companies obviously also reach billions of people through social platforms, and they can help consumers make informed and wise choices that promote societal and environmental benefits and be part of the solution. And this kind of moves are really in the company's long-term interests. Some companies are stepping in and doing it by themselves, and government incentives and legislation in this pandemic recovery mode can really help and can help accelerate those reforms. And the third point that I wanted to mention is the North American extraction heavy profile, which does pose unique challenges we need to accept. Innovation will be required in the primary materials production and resource extraction sectors. I think we all understand that new approaches and clean technology, therefore, are crucial. Recent investments by Canada in innovative green technology for the mining industry, for example, are promising to reduce materials use while enhancing competitiveness and creating jobs. But the transition, needs to be managed carefully with leadership from the sector, because the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement speaks to leaving no one behind. And so people who may lose their jobs need to have alternative livelihoods, need to have support for retraining. And there has to be clearly new prioritized green industry in pandemic recovery packages can help to ensure that any potential folks who may come up short are supported in this transition. And this can be done through, amongst others, obviously, the massive stimulus packages. Now, these are not just some areas in which we see that rapid action could spark a circularity revolution. And we haven't even begun to talk about the finance industry itself, or how public procurement could really build a momentum on the importance, whether in either of the two countries, if public procurement drives a green agenda. So it's clear to us at the United Nations Environment Programme that North America can really take the lead in the world to lead us out of these three planetary crises: the climate crisis, the biodiversity and nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis, by embracing circularity and by embracing a green pandemic recovery. And in this regard, I am so pleased that Canada has made tackling climate crisis a cornerstone of its recovery. We recognize that it's hard, but it's the hard things that demonstrate leadership. So my deep thanks to Minister Wilkinson for his commitment. And I certainly very much look forward to hearing more about the plans and to this continuing conversation with Canada as Canada hosts 2021, the WCEF in Toronto next autumn I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you very much, and thanks once again, Inger Andersen, for highlighting certain issues like how Canada and US are key in solving the planetary crisis and what powerhouses for innovation and inspiration they are also. I mean, I like the way you brought up the city level action in North America and what an inspiration they have also been for European cities to challenge their governments. So thank you indeed. Next, we will be hearing from Jonathan Wilkinson, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Unfortunately, Minister Wilkinson could not be with us live today as he had to attend a critical vote on the emergency pandemic response. However, he was able to record a video for us, and we're certainly looking forward to that. As mentioned, Canada will be hosting the next WCF forum in 2021 in Toronto.
Hello everyone and welcome. I'm pleased to be joining you from Vancouver, Canada on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh people. These are extraordinary times. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused tremendous loss and uncertainty here in Canada and around the world. While our government is focused on the health and well-being of Canadians during this time, we have also committed to building back better after COVID-19. That means creating an economy and a society that is stronger, more resilient, and more sustainable than ever before. And a big part of that is addressing the simultaneous crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. Climate change is already affecting our way of life. In my home city of Vancouver, we had the worst air quality in the world last week due to wildfires in the United States. And biodiversity is declining at an alarming rate. In Canada alone, populations of species assessed as at risk have declined on average 59% since 1970. At this difficult time, we have an opportunity to reflect on how we move forward to ensure a sustainable future for our planet. Certainly, moving aggressively towards a circular economy will help us do just that. We know that circularity reduces emissions, and we know that circularity creates a stronger economy by ensuring we recover resources rather than discard them. One lesson we learned from the pandemic is what we can really accomplish when we all work together, countries, communities, and neighbors, to address a common cause. This is a lesson we all need to apply to the environmental challenges of our time. I believe the journey towards a more circular economy for Canada and the United States will be unique. Our populations are dispersed across a large geography, and our economies rely heavily on our natural resources, unlike some earlier adopters of the circular economy. This gives the region unique characteristics. Looking at the journey ahead for Canada, I am encouraged by the strong foundation that already exists that we can continue to build on. Canada's forest bioeconomy, for example, is already applying circular principles. It is cascading materials and using residues to produce value-added products such as bioplastics, biofuels, and green chemicals. When it comes to clean technology for the circular transition, we have brilliant research institutions and a legacy of innovation that we can leverage to support globally applicable solutions. As a former clean tech CEO myself, I can say this with some confidence. Canada is committed to moving aggressively forward. We have set a target of zero plastic waste by 2030, and we have a comprehensive approach to get there. This includes, in the very near term, banning certain harmful single-use plastics and ensuring more plastic gets recycled by making businesses responsible for their plastic waste. We are also investing in small and medium-sized enterprises to develop solutions to problematic plastics, such as those found in cars and textiles. And we are investing in biodegradable and recyclable PPE, such as gas masks and gowns, which will protect both our health and our environment during COVID. We are also supporting communities and citizens groups to find ways to reduce and recover their plastic waste. Industry is joining with us. This fall, industry leaders, together with the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, will be launching the Canada Plastics Pact. As part of a global network of such pacts, the Canada Plastics Pact will unite leaders in Canada's plastics value chain behind ambitious targets and a bold vision for a circular plastics economy. I recently met with the CEOs of some of Canada's largest companies and know they are committed to working through this platform to drive industry-led innovation to eliminate problematic plastic packaging waste at source and to transition to a more circular economy supply chains. The pandemic has presented us with an opportunity to do better, to build the future that we want and the future that our children need. We all need to work together, governments, industry, innovators, researchers and scientists, our communities, young people, and more. That is why our conversation today is so important. It is also why Canada is so pleased to host the World Circular Economy Forum in 2021 with CITRA and our partners in Toronto next September. This will be, and it must be, more than a great event. It must serve as a catalyst and launching pad for developing a clear and compelling roadmap for the circular economy of the future. Thank you very much.
And Tim, I must say I can't wait until Toronto. and it was wonderful to hear from Minister Wilkinson, although he couldn't be with us today. I think many of us will follow with great interest what is happening in Canada over the next years. So we'll be seeing a short video from North America on a circular solution tackling e-waste as part of CITRA's quest to find inspirational circular solutions and working on a winning recipe for a viable circular package. So please check out our website. The Green for Good program by Compugen Finance has helped resell over 1.8 million end of first life IT assets.
Green for Good is helping businesses manage their end-of-first-life technology by leveraging reuse to convert their old technology into cash, carbon credits, and charitable donation. E-waste is the fastest growing stream of waste in the world. In fact, the United Nations is calling it the tsunami of e-waste. Our solution ensures a 0% landfill for e-waste, but also returns the majority of technology back into the circular economy through product life extension. The circular economy allows us to envision a completely new way of how we consume and use products. Instead of just buying something new and assuming it will end up in a landfill, it creates a mind shift to think about how do we get more from what we already have, and to design products to maximize their life cycle potential. The circular economy also allows us to look at the hidden potential of materials or waste and to realize that there's value here and there's money to be made.
That's exciting, and it makes me think of what our speaker Inger Andersen just said about the role of tech giants in the US and how certain of our materials are finite and we need to keep them in the economy. We would now like to welcome our next moderator for the remainder of this event, actually. And she's actually a WCF veteran herself. Kate Daly, the Executive Director of the Center for the Circular Economy at Closed Loop Partners, a New York City-based hub for collaboration, research, investment, and innovation in packaging, food, the built environment, and textiles. They actually released a report on the circular shift, 4 key drivers of circularity in North America. Do check it out on their website. Kate, it's great to have you back with us. We actually spoke in April about the state of the world in general and the state of the circular economy in particular. And I think it's fair to say that a lot has changed since, and different geographies, different solutions are needed in the circular economy. And when I think of the US, I mentioned the role of universities, but there's also these commitments by large companies But I think that's just a small part of the picture. So I look forward to hearing what you'll be talking about today, and also what your own expectations are for the day.
Great, thanks, Tim. I'm just delighted to be here and to be part of an event focusing on advancing the circular economy in North America. While we here in the US, I'm based in New York, we don't have the same type of unifying mandates that are prevalent in the European Union, but businesses and investors in both the US and Canada are not waiting around for national legislation. They're deploying capital and identifying new business models and opportunities for collaboration. And Tim, as you mentioned, we're seeing many corporations setting ambitious goals and doing the difficult work of identifying how circularity can become an integrated part of their bottom line. And in the absence of national legislation or funding, some cities are launching zero waste mandates and circular business accelerators, like the one that Inger Anderson mentioned in Phoenix, to turn waste into resources and create local jobs. And in all of this, we must together ensure that the new systems we put into place don't perpetuate the negative outcomes of the old ones, where low-income communities are disproportionately affected by the environmental burdens of pollution and waste. Elements of the circular economy have existed within North America for centuries under different names: indigenous stewardship, industrial ecology, recycling, cradle to cradle, environmental justice, remanufacturing. And for the new circular economy to flourish in North America, we must commit to building on this knowledge, in addition to adapting successful European models to our own North American cultures and governing systems. Innovation, investment, policy, and above all, partnership are the key drivers of the new economic model. And of course, digitization is a key enabler. Both the public and private sectors are responding to changing consumer preferences, increasing demands for better outcomes from local communities, and regulatory pressures. And it's the cutting edge sustainable innovations, entrepreneurship, startups, and growing investment opportunities that provide a path forward towards circularity. Certainly, we can all agree the clock is ticking on our current linear economic system, and the circular economy offers a solution, a robust framework that aligns the interests of shareholders, corporations, local communities, and the environment, and is underpinned by core principles of resource efficiency, inclusiveness, and resilience. We're in an age of experimentation, perfecting reusable and refillable packaging models, renting rather than buying clothing, and transferring ownership of products and packaging back to their producers. Our panel title is The Journey to the Circular Economy for a reason. We have a great distance to go, but the panelists we've convened today each have a vision for the roles the public and private sectors can play to accelerate that journey and catalyze inclusive systems and approaches to systems change that shift us toward a better, more circular economy that's both business-led and community-led. And one key ingredient of this will be unexpected and unprecedented collaboration. Now, I'm delighted to introduce each of our panelists. For those of you in the Canadian circular economy space, of course, John Coyne needs no introduction. John is the Vice President, External Affairs and Sustainability at Unilever Canada Inc., where he is a passionate activator of the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, now the Unilever Compass, and that's Unilever's strategy to grow its business, reduce its environmental footprint, and increase its positive contribution to society. John is co-chair of the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition that was launched in 2018 to accelerate Canada's transition to a circular economy, and which is also collaborating with Globe Delphi to launch a Circular Economy Solutions series, which is a Canada-centered platform for advancing solutions through knowledge sharing and leveraging the power of collaboration at the intersection of business and policy. And I encourage all of you to check this new initiative out. You can see it at www.circulareconomysolutionseries.com and learn more. And we'll put that address in the chat as well. John is joining us from Toronto, Canada. And after John, we'll hear from Stephanie Potter, who is the Executive Director of the Sustainability and Circular Economy Program at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. The foundation recently released a study that reveals up to $5 billion and potential savings and 120 million tons of carbon reductions through the adoption of circular practices in the Great Lakes region alone. Stephanie will share with us a model through which other regions can gauge potential impact and drive actionable agendas to enable a circular economy at scale. Stephanie's based out of Washington, D.C. Next, we'll hear from the City of Philadelphia's Smart City Director, Emily Yates. Drawing on her experience studying and working in Europe, Emily is an urban circular economy innovator in the US. She led the development of the Circular Charlotte strategy, which made Charlotte, North Carolina, the first city in the United States to have a citywide circular economy strategy. As Smart City Director for the City of Philadelphia, Emily is responsible for managing and leading the implementation of the Smart City Philadelphia Roadmap that provides guidance on how smart and emerging technology solutions can improve the quality of life for residents, businesses, and visitors. And Emily is joining us from Philadelphia in the US. Rounding out the panel is Stephanie Cairns, who is Director of Circular Economy at Canada's Smart Prosperity Institute, where her research focuses on the role of government in supporting the transition to a circular economy. Stephanie is a member of the Council of Canadian Academies Circular Economy in Canada panel and has been instrumental in creating the Canada Plastics Pact. She's joining us from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. So John, I'm going to hand this over to you to kick us off.
Kate, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for moderating this panel today. And thank you to each of my panelists. I only have a few minutes, but I want to express some gratitude at the outset. First, to Director Anderson and UNEP and Minister Wilkinson for their remarks. Their presence and their words today serve as encouragement to all of us. Also to CITRA and the Government of Canada, thank you for leading and for supporting this particular framework of initiatives. And to my colleagues on the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition, the Natural Step, the Smart Prosperity Institute, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, your energy and your commitment is equally compelling and necessary. At Unilever, this is a journey to circularity, and it's been underway for a long time. Whether we name it purposeful, sustainable, or circular, it represents the same ambition, a world of just, sustainable consumption of enough resources to manage our future as a species, well within the limits available to us on this earth. We have journeyed into a world of sustainability characterized by an understanding of the need for clean energy solutions, reduced resource utilization, modern waste-free product design, strategic, choiceful advocacy for justice and equality throughout all of our markets, and a keen understanding that only long-term, generous, and inclusive strategies and actions are acceptable. This is a more modern iteration of capitalism and capitalist enterprises, perhaps, than we have experienced to this point. But let's make no mistake, we are not, with all of our reach and our scale and our wealth, able as a single enterprise to do more. We have done great works about which we can be justifiably proud. Clean electricity throughout all of our facilities, sustainable agriculture throughout all of our markets, gender and racial justice for all of our workplaces, reduced material consumption, a commitment to natural capital solutions, a commitment to pricing carbon, and ending reliance on fossil fuels with an absolute reductions in plastics. Alone, we cannot solve all of the problems that are before us. We can lead, we can persuade, and we can help, and we are committed to doing that as a member of the private sector. But more is absolutely necessary. We must squarely face the real, immense scale of the problems that confront us, beginning with climate change. So while we are capable of great solutions to these challenges, we have already seen tremendous examples of progress, some from the private sector and some from the public sector. However, we do not yet have a modern, mature dialogue underway at scale between and among policymakers everywhere, the private sector, and civil society. This must change. It is no longer an issue of either or. It is only both. So enough. Intelligent policies will require some element of compulsion and cost and should be designed in concert with the broader private sector, having in mind always the outcome in mind, whether that is in relation to climate, social progress, or economic prosperity. Our dialogue today and in the days ahead should challenge us to think very differently, to abandon all of the stereotypes that have brought us to this point and the old-fashioned position, jurisdictional thinking, and move us to embrace a more selfless inclusive methodology and commitment to solving these challenges, because aspiration and ambition, while fine, are not alone sufficient. What is needed now urgently is a committed leadership and action. And we have said that many times before, and I expect in the dialogue today, we will explore some of that. But let us commit not merely to talk and not merely to blaming each other for the challenges that are before us, but let us commit to a greater imagination and to the absolute certain knowledge, as we have at Unilever, that none of the solutions about which we are wrestling are beyond our grasp. I am delighted to be with you today, and I look forward to the dialogue with my panelists and all of you today. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Don. That's great, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the amount of imagination that we need to bring, and also some element of compulsion. And we'll dig into that in the question and answer period. Now I'll hand it over to Emily Yates from the City of Philadelphia.
Good morning and good evening, wherever you are. I'm really excited to be joining this conversation from a city perspective. I've been working in the circular economy space since 2013, when I worked for a think tank where I facilitated the exchange of policy and best practices for sustainable and livable cities in Europe and the US. And when I first saw De Kovel in North Amsterdam and could see how the circular economy could be a new economic paradigm for cities in the US, like the legacy cities that we have in the Northeast, who were struggling to revive or recover their economies, I became very passionate about the topic and helping cities move this forward. I think what really drew me to the concept was that it can be applied across all city systems. It focuses on waste, and it's not just waste from products that we consume, but it's also within the electrical systems, it's within our water systems, and there's really just so much opportunity. Resource extraction is the key problem that needs to be solved, and cities are a huge consumer of those resources. So they are critical to the conversation, because I like to say cities are where the innovation and policy rubber hit the pavement. I think one of the challenges that cities sees are that we are looked to as bottomless buckets of funds. And people get frustrated working with cities because we move quite slowly, especially in a place where circular economy requires innovation to happen and happen hopefully quite rapidly. But in the circular economy, everyone has a role to play. This is not just one entity that's going to drive it forward, but really everyone working together and collaborating. And I think it's best to identify what role is best suited for cities. And so it's always important, and I always emphasize this when I talk about the circular economy, that what are the mechanisms that cities can adjust and leverage to help support this? Cities are not going to be leading the innovation. We are not going to be the innovators, but what we can do is create an ecosystem that is supportive of this innovation by developing relevant policies or adjusting policies that might be hindering the transition to a circular state, driving partnerships, deploying critical infrastructure, and leveraging procurement powers to really help drive this transition. And you're starting to see cities in the US do this more. You're seeing Austin taking a lead. Here in Philadelphia, we've already deployed an urban mining tool to map what's in our construction and demolition waste stream, and hopefully keep that in circulation rather than going to our landfills. You're seeing it in San Francisco, and as Inger Anderson mentioned, in Phoenix, which has been a great leader in this space. And while I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about the current situation that cities are experiencing due to COVID, and in the US, at least around our Black Lives Matter protest, it's really quite sobering. I know specifically in Philadelphia in this past year, we've lost $750 million of our budget. We've had that cut. And so that can really put a damper on what we're trying to do in this transition, but I really see it as a great opportunity to push the circular economy forward and make it front and center as an economic recovery tool. And those are the dialogues that I'm working to have here within Philadelphia. And really quickly, I just want to speak to my time in Charlotte, because I think that's a great example of how, when you're working with cities, you can adapt the circular economy conversation, similar again to what Inger Anderson was talking about, but how you can kind of get buy-in from cities that are really focused on this economic recovery and addressing COVID. The way I got the city to support and buy into the development of the Circular Charlotte strategy which maps the waste stream of the city, which is critical, right, for circular economy, but also lays out 5 business strategies, is that when it was pitched, it wasn't a focus on environmental impact, because at the time that wasn't what the city was targeting. The city manager was really trying to address the fact that a study had been published that a child born into poverty in Charlotte had a 4% chance of coming out of poverty in his or her lifetime, which is a really staggering statistic. And you think, well, how does environment play a part in that? And it's actually quite critical to that conversation. So when I spoke of circularity, it was mostly focused on how it creates new economic opportunities and job opportunities for underskilled, unemployed, hard to employ individuals in Charlotte that are the focus of that study. And that's ultimately what they grabbed onto. And when you talk to them, that is what they talk to, is it's a strategy for economic mobility. And I think as we're seeing cities pilot and innovate and pivot more quickly to address COVID, we're going to see that conversation of circularity adapt to that perspective as well. So I look forward to having more discussions about this with my panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. That's great to hear, and I think we'll have a robust discussion about the links between circularity and resilience and economic development, poverty alleviation, all of the issues that city policymakers care about the most. I'll hand it over now to Stephanie Potter to share her thoughts.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, John and Emily. Really excited to be back together with you all talking about these things. I think some of what's been said so far around the relevance of circular strategies in our current moment and sort of the tactics we need to employ to effectively collaborate across sectors, across industries, across regions. These are all really important things and things that we've been working on at the Chamber Foundation. So on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce Foundation, thanks for the opportunity to plug into this really important set of dialogues today and tomorrow. So my name is Stephanie Potter. Kate already introduced me. I oversee our sustainability and circular economy efforts on behalf of the foundation. We've long had a focus on the business opportunity in pursuing the circular economy. Given our network of businesses, we're really always looking at what can we do to lift up the economic opportunities that are inherent in a lot of these sustainability strategies and directions and pivots that companies could make, and how can we start to fill gaps in what is needed for them to make the case to kind of going that direction. So the research that was mentioned earlier and that I hope we'll get into today in terms of not just the mechanics, but more importantly, the relevance and the takeaways, was looking at how to sort of evaluate the economic opportunity and shifting to fully circular business models in North America, taking as a case study the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region, due in part to the sort of high concentration of businesses operating there in sectors that are really reliant on limited resources for long-term viability. So the ones we focused on here were, in terms of materials, wood, paper, and pulp, steel, and paper. Also because of the cross-border impact, so not only state-by-state implications, but also province to state in terms of the inclusion of provinces that in Canada that touch the Great Lakes. And then lastly, the buy-in from stakeholders that we had around these themes here in this region, both on the policymaker side through our work with chief executives around the region, but also with the cohort of companies that helped drive some of the thinking for this work. So within each material, just quickly, and then we can kind of get back into it later, we looked at kind of, sort of the recycling, reduction, and reuse elements. With plastics, we really looked at recycling. With steel, we looked at reduction. And with wood, paper, and pulp, looking at kind of recycled feedstocks and some of the reuse strategies that are possible there. We looked at, Kate mentioned the economic sort of advantages that we calculated, which were anywhere between $4.4 and $5 billion, due to just how we did sort of partial scenarios, looking at whether companies are employing existing technologies or full, kind of more ambitious scenarios where new technologies are being leveraged to make these circular transitions. Environmentally, seeing really kind of strong carbon dioxide tonnage reductions, and so really kind of looking at the environmental implications as well as the economic. Obviously, that's very important too. So, I think really what we're most most interested in doing with this kind of study is really making a stronger business case and also kind of making more granular the steps to mainstreaming circular economy and offering decision makers and companies that are operating both in and outside of the Great Lakes region with ways to quantify, capture, and communicate the value of going in this direction. So that's what that among many other things is what I'm most excited to get into with everybody today.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And I think we're all in agreement that the storytelling around the economic opportunities and other opportunities that we can capture is absolutely critical in what are, in some ways, early days for the circular economy in North America as compared to some of our European counterparts. So Stephanie Cairns, I'll hand it over to you to share your thoughts.
Thank you, Kate. 3 points jump out for me as I reflect on what might be distinctive about North America's journey towards a circular economy, but thinking at some of the higher level challenges that we faced. First, Europe enjoys a stronger consensus on environmental files than we broadly enjoy here in North America, where the topic can be very polarized and policies can swing widely between every new government. This points to the critical importance for us of initiatives such as Stephanie just described, building broad-based constituencies, champions, and partnerships for the circular economy, communities which can steward this agenda and reinforce leadership from governments at all levels and between government to government. The Canada Plastics Pact that will launch later this fall is one example, and I'm very excited to announce that the website has just gone live today at plasticspact.ca. We can also look to the province of Quebec, where a unique ecosystem of university researchers, business and civil society leaders, and policymakers have been collaborating over the last 6 years to develop the knowledge, the communities of practice, and a common vision that has propelled Quebec to become North America's leader at the regional level on the circular economy. And the Canada-US Great Lakes collaborations that were also mentioned are similar models for what we need. Second, and as mentioned earlier today, the models we have for the circular economy have been developed through a European lens of resource importing countries that have manufacturing intensive economies. Canada is a resource producing economy. Primary resource sectors make up 11% of our GDP and more than half the value of all the goods we export. This means that a North American model for the circular economy needs to be broadened. We need to rethink the model and adapt it to include the lens of resource producers. Circular economy strategies to bring new value and new opportunities to primary resource sectors and to address the continued role of primary as well as cycled resources in providing for future material security. The reality, of course, is that we're going to be needing both primary and cycled materials. And we need to improve our understanding of how one would inform and shape the other. And I'm very hopeful that this will be a major theme for next year's World Forum. Finally, and I think quite fundamentally, our founding myth and continued outlook in North America is one of plenty. Plentiful resources to be exploited, plentiful space for growth, plentiful consumption. Europe and Asia, in contrast, have historically had more need to manage pressures on space, on local resources, and on local ecosystems. This means that in the North American context, it is likely going to be the economic and the business case for the circular economy that is the strongest message that will resonate the best. For example, opportunities arising from new business models, our advantages in AI and big data technologies, or looking to remanufacturing. To wrap up, I expect differences in the respective roles of government versus business and society in leading the transition, in the need to engage primary producers in the vision, and in how best to frame the case for a circular economy. Thank you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I think we'll kick off the discussion by building on the point that you just made about messaging and the way that the context within North America needs a different sort of message than what we've seen in other countries and nations. In North America, we're still building and defining circularity, and even the phrase the circular economy is not a term that's widely known. And so let's get concrete. Can we talk about some specific examples of the circular economy in action that can illustrate to a wider audience what this means, what kind of impact it can have, and how does this really work? What is the circular economy? So I'd love to hear from some of you some specific examples that you might use to illustrate how the circular economy has a positive impact within a North American context.
Who wants to start? Kate, maybe I will, because I'm going to point to an area with which I've developed some degree of familiarity over the years, and that has a lot to do with a subject that keeps coming up, which is recycling and reuse. The intersection of private industry, private investment, and public policy related to what is now known as extended producer responsibility is, in fact, I think, one of the examples that we need to take a closer look at if we're truly going to understand what it means to eliminate bad things from our economy. The whole framework for extended producer responsibility does what it is supposed to do, which is to shift responsibility for a particular activity or a particular material or a particular framework to certain groups and individuals who have the capability to better manage material. The challenge that we have, and you have it in the United States to a far greater degree than we have it here in Canada, is that we don't have any kind of set of standards or policy coordinations that will drive the scale and the synergy and therefore the investment potential to allow us to exploit the opportunities behind an expression like EPR. So it is symptomatic of this divide that we have between hopeful optimism with people expressing, great ambitions about what it means to be circular, and the people who can actually frame a regulatory system that will, in fact, create the investment structures and the incentives, and indeed the disincentives necessary to affect circularity. That, to me, is a good one, but we can talk about green procurement and a whole bunch of things if we want to.
Well, and maybe just to piggyback on John's point about incentives, I think that's true that, this is a different market where we're lacking some of the incentives that are in place in Europe and accelerating some of this. I think that's all the more reason to start with some of the things that we can do today, given the tools in our basket. And so that's, some of what I was referencing, our sort of relevance takeaways was kind of speaking to in the most recent study. I mean, there's a multitude of examples that we are highlighting every day about circular economy pivots that companies, large multinationals in this region are making, many of which are coming under the sort of banner of time-bound commitments toward sustainable development targets and the like. But and we could spend all day talking about those, and I'm happy to point folks to resources on specific examples. But I think what's most interesting is just what are the tools in our basket, and some of the ones that we emphasized in our report that focused on the Great Lakes were embracing the broader aspects of circularity. So improve soil health, air quality, water quality, job creation opportunities, making sure that we're incorporating kind of equitable practices and how we are responding kind of post-COVID, all of these sorts of sort of broader considerations, aligning to mainstream practices. So looking at where existing technologies are and how those can be overlaid. We've been seeing some really exciting code innovations coming out of COVID with respect to how folks are pivoting to respond to current kind of demand streams and all of that. I think there are some really good learnings in there that we can take to further circular strategies writ large. And then I think another one is kind of starting with where your data sort of shows you are. So really looking at kind of ground truthing your current state and doing that at a local level. Finding partnerships who can sort of with direct beneficiaries, so folks that are looking for secondary markets for materials, folks that are offering a remanufacturing service, finding more creative ways for working with your supply chain. These are all things that I think, they exist today. It's just a matter of finding how to sort of connect the dots, and that's a lot of what we've been working on.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say I think there's a risk with the circular economy agenda that is seen as a competitive agenda with all the other environmental agendas on the table. And in reality, as Emily said, a lot of elements of the circular economy are already pieces that we're working on actively in North America. We just haven't kind of brought them together under this larger framing that is a more visionary framing. And I think it's extremely important that we not walk in the door as, hey, we've got a new idea, but we go and we look at other initiatives that are underway and that have strong constituencies and a lot of investment in them, whether it's clean technologies, whether it's zero waste mining, whether it's the bioeconomy, the conversation that's happening on sustainable finance, green procurement, and how can we build on and infiltrate essentially those initiatives with this larger and more encompassing and pulling together agenda. So I think in order not to alienate business, it's very important that we not come in with, what's could be construed as a new agenda. We have to be clear, though, that it is a much more ambitious and bolder and more integrated agenda. I think in terms of the general public, just the story on waste is one that, every individual responds to. For instance, I give an example, Vancouver, where close to where I live is a city with, immense urban development going on. Many of the older homes that are being knocked down include timber from irreplaceable 100-year-old growth trees, like timber that is 400 years old, perhaps, because these houses were built 100 years ago. And in most practice right now, although that is being recovered, it's going for energy from waste, being used as fuel. But there's a great upstart circular economy company that's actually salvaging timber from those houses. They're actually dismantling it. They're creating lots of jobs, and that timber is incredibly valuable to furniture makers and green builders who need eco-certified wood or old growth timber for their activity. So that's the type of story that also resonates with the public, that instinctively says, how can we be wasting such a valuable resource and sending it just to be, as fuel?
And I'll just add on what Stephanie was talking about, because that ties in nicely to the urban mining tool that we created here for that exact purpose. We have quite a lot of old houses here that are just being demolished, and bricks and timber and everything is going together and going into landfill. And part of the impetus for creating that was the opportunity to create a materials marketplace where we could keep it. And the hope was even regionally start to connect to the deconstruction industry. But I think from a city perspective, what I'm seeing a lot of hope around is, one, there are cities that are starting to develop an overarching citywide strategy, which I think is really helpful in framing their expectations and how the private sector can connect to the efforts of the city more concisely and clearly, and kind of speak the language of the city. But also these innovation hubs and these innovation spaces. It's not a new topic. Cities have been having spaces like this, but pivoting the focus to a circular economy framework has been really interesting. Again, Phoenix is a great example of that and how that's really driven their pipeline of innovation in the circular economy space. And I think one of the key parts that's often overlooked in these innovation hubs is the opportunity for cities and private sector to come together over a municipal challenge and really collaborate and co-create, and using that framework of circular economy to drive that conversation. And I think that having that space for the groups to come together and really co-solve these issues is going to be critical as we try to transition.
And I'm hearing a lot of examples of tools that have been successful in advancing materials marketplace, EPR, complex, but a tool that could benefit from standardization, from more work, data-driven approaches, things that are business friendly and that tell the story of waste in a way that resonates. And thinking about those tools and many more, how do we identify what are the critical industries or sectors that we want to deploy these tools in first? How do we make sure that we're telling the story in a way that does reach communities and is business friendly? Are there specific examples of sectors? Stephanie, you talked about the built environment and construction as a very specific example of an industry that resonates with the public, creates jobs, and is business friendly. Are there other examples that all of you have worked with where these tools can be implemented within a certain sector that can be targeted as an opportunity for circular growth?
I know I ended the last comment or question, but I'm going to chime in first. And I think to tie into what you were highlighting with Stephanie in the construction industry, I think the construction industry will actually be a great opportunity. When we come out of economic kind of downturns, it's often the development industry that really drives that. We need housing. We need buildings to be built. So there's a lot of opportunity, but what we're seeing here in Philadelphia, at least, is that we don't have that pipeline of understanding that it's not only about deconstruction, but it's also about design and construction, so that we're designing buildings to be deconstructed and then we're building them in a way that allows it to be effectively deconstructed. But then also, how do you deconstruct, right? And we don't have that kind of pipeline of knowledge. So for me, partnerships with academia, both K through 12, so we're educating at a very early age that this is a normal, a standard, an expectation that we should have, but also then helping people recognize that there's value in the trade industry. I know in the U.S. that there's oftentimes a negative perception of those jobs, but they're critical and so valuable. And then also just in the design, I often think back to actually a European example where they had trades industry and college students coming together to do projects in the community so they could start to learn to communicate with each other. And even something as simple as that is really impactful to helping kind of drive this system.
Emily, yeah, John, please go ahead.
Well, I wanted to just make a slightly different comment because I don't really want to pick on an individual sector because we can go down, I think, a lot of rabbit holes with that. One of the things, and Emily just mentioned the word standards, one of the things that we seem to run away from rather quickly is the whole notion of how do we develop standards that will be utilized by a broad array of economic actors, building codes, for example, and renewable energy. We don't actually apply ourselves to designing the standards that will contribute materially across a whole lot of different jurisdictions, not just Philadelphia, not just Phoenix, but also New York and Los Angeles and Ottawa and Toronto, et cetera, et cetera. We don't apply ourselves to designing those standards in such a way that we can then implement those standards in the way that the locality needs to implement it, because all cities are different, for example, all jurisdictions are different. But the standards associated with certain of our activities we shy away from. That was my point about compulsion earlier. We also don't, and we seem to go out of our way to ensure that the green choice, and I put that in quotation marks, but the climate-friendly choice or the green choice is not the cheapest choice. And that's a policy decision. That is ensuring that the markets and pricing for materials and services should be looked at through a green and climate-friendly lens in particular, and that we should construct our pricing and market systems and the signals that go with that in accordance with those standards. If we did some of that work, then the work that the Stephanies and Emily and everybody else are doing is going to get a little easier, because you're going to look at those standards, you're going to go, great, I know how to work with that in the city of Philadelphia, for example. And I know that Charlotte is doing what they're doing, but I know how to implement that in the city of Philadelphia. That is going to require a modern and courageous level of jurisdictional collaboration, not cooperation, but collaboration that we have not yet seen. But if we don't call that out, then the nonsense that takes place in Washington will continue. And the nonsense that takes place in Canada as the provinces and the federal government fight each other is going to continue. We have to call that out, and we have to demand that those kinds of standards be put in place. Anyway, I'm sounding a little dour today, but forgive me.
Not at all. And I think your point about design standards and also that cities aren't left on their own to identify the way to move ahead. This is not easy work. It's quite challenging. And here in the U.S., we look to Charlotte and Phoenix for the lessons that they've learned, so that the other cities, including New York, which is currently considering what is our circular city roadmap, we need to look at those other cities to identify ways to move forward and to make sure that the data that we come up with about job creation actually aligns with the realities, is persuasive, is tangible. And just building on the points that you and Emily have made, what are the types of collaboration that can make that work, that can de-silo all of these efforts? So it's not just an individual government that is focused on their own ribbon cutting, but rather it's looking at standardizing the lessons learned, and even beyond government, looking in the private sector as well. What are the types of collaboration? Emily, you gave a great example of a collaboration with academia to allow for training that can drive toward workforce readiness. Are there other collaborations between the public and the private sector, or across cities, across nations, that you've seen that can accelerate the circular transition and help us all move past examining the problem and into more widespread acceptance or incentivizing this transition?
Well, I think Quebec is a very interesting example. It's fascinating, even as a Canadian. The Quebec example, because it's all conducted in French, is really very much, and the international networks that they move in are all the Francophone networks, and so that experience has not been transferred to the rest of Canada as much. But in Quebec, there has been this really strong effort to create what I call a full innovation ecosystem. And I think that's one of the keys here, is to really understand that what we're looking at is system-wide innovation, and we have to build across that full ecosystem. So what does that mean? It means we need to build knowledge. We need to build capacity, whether it's, generating students who have been trained in these approaches, building competence within the private sector and understanding these issues. It means communities of practice, because we don't know the solutions, so we have to problem solve. And a lot of the solutions are going to come from very cross-cutting, non-linear approaches to things. And so we have to have very unusual collaborations and innovation hubs to make that happen. And then that whole foundation is what drives the public policy buy-in, because you've got, essentially a strong cross-cutting constituency. And in Quebec, they've done some very interesting work in trying to analyze, okay, where is their comparative advantage going to be? Which sectors do they actually have both enough demand for materials, so they're producing kind of the secondary feedstock, but also industries capable of receiving that feedstock and turning it into new materials. And they've used kind of some very strong research to identify what priority areas they should be working in.
And, I think that's another just reason that private sector has to be part of these conversations, because there's so much cross sector in, large multinationals and where they're serving and what they're doing. And there's so much cross region. And I think we're in a moment now where the business community does want to be part of these conversations at the local level and with cities, and finding tools in their toolkit to be able to do that and push the right sort of levers where they can. And just a couple of examples of that. I mean, to the earlier point about sort of where to start from a sector, looking at strategies like Walmart's in terms of their kind of gigaton approach, and what they were looking at first with respect to where's the highest footprint of greenhouse gas emissions coming from, and how can we work with our suppliers to make sure we're mitigating there first. I think these kinds of approaches that companies take, which are very sort of logical and sort of efficiency oriented, can be helpful. And I think that there are carryovers across sectors that we can look at that are sort of similar. I mean, and to the point about education, I mean, Lego just launched its replay strategy in Canada, which is all about educating its consumers or its stakeholders, who are children and the parents of children, about some of these concepts of the circular economy and what it means to be thinking about end of life in a more creative sort of extension orientation. So that's all about, kind of bringing blocks back after you're done playing with them and allowing other folks to play with them. So it's components of the circular sort of transition that I think companies are kind of starting to creatively, and have been for a while, in some cases creatively thinking about, that are very applicable across a lot of these different conversations.
And in the 2 minutes that remain, I'll jump to a question from our audience. Someone asked, how can we create a framework for de-risking circular projects in an early stage of development? And I think that speaks exactly to Stephanie, John, and Emily, what you've been describing, which is a robust private sector in this time of experimentation and really doing a lot of testing and piloting, piloting is where it's critical that cities and the private sector work together to allow for that sort of on-the-ground implementation and testing before we scale, to make sure that we can find inclusive, accessible, and economically viable solutions. As you know, John, that the green choice can be the affordable choice. And I think that part of that testing, piloting, and scaling, and with the proper incentives and policies in place, can absolutely get us there. So since we're at time, I'd like to thank all of you, thank our panelists for your insights today. Thank you, Citra, for hosting us for this very engaging discussion. Much more to come. Tim and Vera, I'll hand things over to you for your final remarks.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, friends and collaborators in Canada and the US. It really aptly highlighted the need to dive into a different geographical context, I think. Mm-hmm. And the motivators for going circular in North America are understandably different from Europe or Asia. I think one of you put it really nicely that North America is the land of plenty, space, resources, and wealth. Therefore, the catalyst must be that going CE is just really the best business case. And what I found particularly encouraging was that businesses and investors are not waiting around for national legislation. They are just going ahead. So really, Tim, I think we've reached the end of day one WCF online marathon. And it's been wonderful. The reason I say it's a marathon because there are just so many thoughts in my head. And it certainly has been inspiring, and big thoughts that have been said out loud. I think it was Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister Wilkinson, who really says that, well, the world is on fire. And Timmermans said, we're not saving planet Earth, it's just planet humanity.
Right.
But what are your thoughts, Tim?
Well, I think you covered two pretty great points there. The world is on fire and it's about saving humanity. And then incremental changes they're just not good enough. And I would like to connect that also to what Stephanie said on that we need ecosystem innovation. We can't just look at this piecemeal and these small pieces. We need to take a big approach to this. And what else to say? I think we started the day with Timmermans really giving that speech, and then a sense of the EU providing that sense of direction. But there are so many different solutions that are happening all over, and they're all needed in this transition.
And this was just day one. So tomorrow it's going to be, my expectations are really high for tomorrow. And we will begin where everything began, really, for humanity, as we are going to be diving into the oldest continent. And really, I mean, I can't wait to hear about how many of tomorrow's views will touch upon digital technologies, which in the circular economy context help us move from value closer to value from less.
I think Inger Andersen said with the importance of tech-savvy youth, and this is the youngest continent, so I think we have a lot to look forward to, basically.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, and please do tune in tomorrow. Thank you again.